Continuing our discussion of institutional factors behind Asian American success, where we left off last time was in the notion that Asian America itself could be differentiated based on socioeconomics, that is to say, different social class standings within the entire Asian American communities, right? So, what we're talking about here is social class. And of course, there are upper class versus the middle class versus the lower class. And of course, socioeconomics wields a very powerful factor when it comes to educational attainment. As we noted last time, when we compared, let's say, in the Chinese versus South Asian in more contemporary society. So let me cite a research here conducted by academics. What they did is study upper and working class Chinese students in New York. Okay, now the upper class would attend elite universities, and it was largely based on their secondary education, that's to say high school, right? So just like any other ethnic groups, you tended to attend or be accepted to elite universities if you're from the upper class. And certainly that applies with Asian Americans. So in the study, they found that many of the upper class Asian Americans that were, from really good secondary education, like private schools or very established high schools, public high schools, they went on to attend Columbia University, New York University. On the other hand, they looked at lower class or working class Chinese in New York City and followed them from their secondary education to their university. And what they found is that quite predictably, they became or they were accepted at the less known or less established colleges within the area, like Hunter College in New York, not to mention community colleges. So, like any other ethnic group, you see social class as a powerful determining factor in educational success here. So that should surprise us. Now, another thing that matters crucially, and this was in our previous discussion of especially Indo-Chinese, is the centrality of the refugee experience, as we mentioned, trauma. Right, trauma is going to be a centerpiece in the lives of many Asian American immigrant families, and it's intergenerational, meaning that you even have second and third generation, the offspring of the original immigrants coming from Indochina, uh, still somehow having psychological problems that they inherit from, the older generation. And for example, when researchers looked at the Hmong immigrants, what they found was the children of the Hmong, well, their educational experiences were similar to, let's say, African Americans in the inner city neighborhoods because they dealt with trauma, similar to how, let's say, lower class African Americans in the inner city might experience, stress and trauma based on things like street gangs and violence and crime and murder, which is, of course, much more commonplace in their environment compared to a middle class suburb. Well, that's going to factor very importantly in their educational attainment. And they see that parallel with the Hmong, okay, because they were surrounded by similar circumstances. So, this is important to take into account when we think about success in, quote, Asian America, that social class matters a lot. Well, to kind of wrap up our discussion of, quote unquote, Asian American exceptionalism, and in particular, educational exceptionalism, well, let's go back to that stereotype of the so called Asian American whiz kid. And let's go back also to the assimilation theory. That is, you have this Asian American stereotype as the whiz kid who, via cultural reasons, they assimilate into the U.S. school system. And remember, the assimilation theory sees the school system that supposedly rewards anyone who works hard and studies hard and has intelligence. Well, what we see here is that, contemporary research, right? Not the traditional assimilation theory, but contemporary research finds that when it comes to Asian Americans, actually most attend public universities, not elite. This is very contrary to that stereotype. Almost half actually begin college at the community college level. And this is especially true among certain ethnic groups within what's called Asian America, like particularly true with Pacific Islanders, Filipinos, Vietnamese, and researchers have found that college costs itself are the primary concern. So this is contrary to this idea of scholarships just being, won by all these quote unquote whiz kids, right? Or the notion of affirmative action programs in universities at the same time. So again, this is a social class issue. And we already remarked upon the variability within the Asian American category itself, like that chart that we looked at before, right? Educational attainment differs by ethnicity. I have the statistics here. Indian Americans, 72% receive the bachelor's degree. Filipinos, less than half, right? Um, Vietnamese, 26%. Cambodian, under 15. So that's much less than half, right? 65% have high school degrees among the Hmong. So that's very low compared to the national average. So again, variability and heterogeneity, right? Much more so than conceived when you think about the Asian American model minority. Okay, so variability, heterogeneity of scholastic outcomes, it belies that model minority image. It contradicts it. And also, just as a reminder, for middle class Asian, much of their success relies on ethnic community resources and support systems, thus breaking away from that assimilation theory that ethnicity doesn't matter according to that theory, right, in the public education school. Well, it does matter when it comes to more contemporary immigration. Now, research has also found that race still plays a central part in education. That is, educational attainment is not due to the end of discrimination, and that's the idea of assimilation perspective, right? But as a way to overcome discrimination, as I remarked upon earlier. This is what's preached to the children of immigrant parents. And it's also a recourse in the face of lack of social capital, right? Okay, and one thing I remarked upon earlier, just again to finish up this topic, there's some hidden aspects lost in this whole model minority myth. We can now begin to call it a myth, the model minority myth, after I presented you this research, right? And as I mentioned, this is largely due to mental health challenges. You see pressures derived from parenting styles in some cases, right? As I mentioned earlier, saving face of the family, right? You don't want to, embarrass your family, your parents, right? And that serves as a large source of pressure. You see peer pressure from other students, especially of co-ethnics. All these reasons connected to the immigrant experience again. So because of this, researchers note a high rate of mental health issues. In other words, the educational success is not a good predictor for happiness and mental health among the students. Now, for example, in some research, they found that Chinese American students suffer from anxiety and depression and low self-esteem at significantly higher rates than whites. And they even compared it to Chinese students in China, and they found that Chinese Americans suffered from high rates of anxiety and depression compared to Chinese students in China itself. And one particular statistics that I think, or one study that really reflects this, was done a while back. It was in 2005. But it was a study at Cornell University, which, as you know, is an Ivy League, very prestigious. And when they looked at the annual rates of suicides at Cornell University in 2005, it was noted that Asian Americans constituted 50% of the suicides, even though Asian Americans comprised only 17% of the entire Cornell University student population. Okay, so they counted for half of the suicides there. When it comes to gender, you see second generation Asian American women having higher rates of depression and suicide compared to any other racial group in the U.S. Interestingly enough, this is particularly shown with second generation Filipino American. They're more inclined to commit suicide compared to other Filipino Americans of different gender, different age. Okay, so overall conclusion, instead of that more rosy picture of the Asian American minority or whiz kids, when you really think about it, the reason Asian Americans do well is the same reasons most other most other Americans in general do well. And here we have to think about how social class and educational background matter. The post-1965 professional managerial class, they come here as professionals. Their children will be more inclined to succeed in the university and higher education. And you compare that with those, for example, refugees, let alone the pre-1965 Asian immigrants who are mostly, not all, but mostly unskilled menial workers, right? You don't see the amount of praise and exceptionalism cast upon those children compared to post-1965 because socioeconomics matters a lot.